Okay. All right. Welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Raywat Deonandan, who is an associate professor with the Interdisciplinary School of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa. He is a global health epidemiologist, a widely published writer and science communicator, and an award-winning novelist. So, Dr. Deonandan, thanks for coming on today.
It is my exquisite pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So, just starting off, when did you first get interested in science communication?
Wow, that's a question I did not anticipate.
Surprise!
So originally I was a writer and I have a background in teaching, and I became a professor later in life. I was a scientist for a variety of institutions in between. It was just a natural extension of the core skills that I have. I don't consider myself to be a good scientist. I'm a mediocre scientist. I don't try to win the Nobel Prize. I don't try to get grant money. I really don't. I consider myself a teacher and a communicator. And I think it's something that I was stunned to discover is a rare skill set in academia in general and in science in particular, the ability to engage with a variety of audiences in language and using terms and touchstones that most people understand. To take it off on a tangent, it's been amazing watching the demand for this skill set really grow and watching just how little we've invested as a society in inculcating the professional class with the ability to engage with a variety of stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because I mean, I remember taking science classes in college, and it was always kind of a game among students to figure out, okay, what professors are really good at teaching, what they knew a lot about, and how can they communicate to someone who doesn't know about it. And then you take that just as society as a whole, and you look at the number of people that never took a college science course trying to understand what scientists may be saying in the media. That's a really tough game to
Not
play.
just that, but you have to distinguish between those who really know their stuff versus those who can communicate their stuff.
Yeah,
I'm fond of telling my students, it's great if you are the crazy genius who knows everything, but you're not that useful to society unless you can translate that knowledge in some sort of
yeah.
useful way. So in many ways, the clever person who can communicate with the crazy genius and communicate with the wider public is more valuable than the crazy genius to begin with.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, the impact you make when you have, all people on board for some scientific principle is much more important because you can't utilize the science otherwise if people don't believe in it or accept it because they don't understand it. So,
Yeah, 100%. I keep thinking about Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I admire to a great extent, and he's fond of saying all scientists should attempt to engage with the public, and I think he's
yeah.
right to a very large extent. He talks about going to the pub and saying, "Hey, when's the next time these people are going to meet an astrophysicist? Ask me whatever you want." The difference, though, as I'm fond of telling my students, is that as an astrophysicist, no one's identity is tied to what happens on the other side of the event horizon of a black hole.
Yeah.
No one's identity is tied to what is dark matter. That's an interesting conversation. Whereas for me in the health sciences, everyone has deep connections to their personal health.
Yeah.
Everyone's got life or death opinions on aspects of healthcare, on pharmaceuticals, on vaccines, whatever it might be. So every time I touch my toe into the wider pool of public discourse, it comes at a great danger, and it
Yeah.
usually comes with a lot of conflict.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot more risk involved with getting the correct information out there when it comes to people's health. So, so I'm curious then, when did you first become concerned with sort of the rise in pseudoscience online?
Oh, during the pandemic. So
Okay.
my involvement in pandemic communication was sudden, unplanned, and quite extensive. So early on, I'm an epidemiologist. My wife was pregnant as the pandemic started, and I was taking it easy. I thought, well, I'm going to go on paternity leave, let somebody else deal with this crisis. Then I did my own modeling, like disease modeling one night,
Hmm.
and I discovered what the infectious disease epidemiologists had figured out at that point, but had not been widely communicated yet, which was that this is not a weeks long experience. This is going to take years to get over, if ever. And I found myself in the fetal position. My wife found me the next morning and goes, "What's wrong?" It occurred to me that my elderly parents might never meet my coming child. We might be
Yeah.
locked indoors that long, and they might die before that ever happens, considering how fatal this disease is. I realized I had to do something, And one day my child will ask me, Dad, you're an epidemiologist. What did you do during the great pandemic of 2020?
Yeah.
And, I haven't got the skills to cure the disease, but I reasoned I have the skills to communicate about the disease. So I wrote a blog post called COVID-19, What is the End Game? In which I explain what herd immunity is, what the timeline for a vaccine probably is, why people are locked inside, all that stuff. And my blog usually got a couple hundred reads per week. That one got 500,000 reads in 1 week.
Wow.
And I realized, oh boy, there's a thirst for
Yeah.
someone with some degree of authority to be commenting on this. And sure enough, media started knocking on my door. And over the course of the next year and a half, I did over 2,000 media engagements, all around just answering basic questions around COVID-19. So in that process came the attacks, the hate mail, the accusations from people unwilling or unable to engage with objective science, for whom they are suffering for whatever reason, economically, health-wise, and they need someone to blame. So why not the talking head on TV who's
Yeah.
talking about this stuff? So it became clear that there's an untapped, what's the word I'm looking for? An untapped discontent in society that was only starting to show its face. And now 3 years later, it's all over. Of course, it's the face of the divide between left and right, between other kinds of ideologies that's taken over the world. So I first started noticing it then. I know our conversations about pseudoscience, but it's
Hmm.
more than that.
Oh, sure.
There's something profoundly interesting happening here and terrifying around competing paradigms of reality.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and again, I want to talk more about that if I can, but
Go for it.
that's essentially what we're talking about here. Is we make assumptions about what science is. And I don't want to be speaking for science, but as a scientist, we teach our students and are taught by our mentors about, what objective evidence looks like. Except that's not what other people are taught necessarily.
Yeah.
So all of research, depending upon your discipline, is defined by a research paradigm of some kind. And in general, there are three research paradigms. There's the positivist, the post-positivist, and the interpretivist. And as an epidemiologist, my discipline falls within positivism. And positivism assumes that there is objective truth.
Hmm.
And I can access that objective truth by doing experiments, collecting data. And I can't get it perfectly right all the time, but I inch closer and closer to describing the universe in a genuine materialistic fashion. Post-positivism holds that I can never really objectively measure the universe, but I can pretend to. And I can
Okay.
wave my hands around and get something useful. And the interpretivists feel that there is no truth. There's your truth, there's my truth, and we can never find common ground. Until we realize that people are coming at this from different paradigms of belief, we're never going to find common ground in how to discuss, supposedly objective truths. Another way of looking at it is how evidence is perceived. So in epidemiology, in a positivist objectivist way of thinking, there's a pyramid of evidence. At the very top, there are these carefully constructed randomized controlled trials, which have been somewhat fetishized, in the
Sure.
past few months. We can talk about that for sure. And at the very bottom, there's personal opinion. My best friend said, or my doctor said, or my best friend's girlfriend's doctor said, or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
And and we assume as positivists that the apex of evidence at the very top, the randomized control trials and meta-analyses of randomized control trials drive decision-making and belief. That's not true, though.
Yeah.
In reality, it's flipped over. Most decisions at the policy level, if you watch, Congress or in Parliament, elected officials are banging their fists on the table saying, I just heard from a constituent who told me this. It's personal experience, anecdote. So most people's paradigm of belief is around personal experience and anecdote. We as scientists pretend that our paradigm of understanding the universe is about objective, measurable evidence. They are not compatible. So
Yeah.
often we as scientists and general public are talking at cross purposes using not just different language, different paradigmatic realities. And this has to be addressed in some way, shape, or fashion.
Yeah. I mean, I think that really hits the nail on the head, because when it comes to any type of field that's based on evidence, I think this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Just thinking about the field of history, the amount of people believing in pseudo history, I think, is growing pretty fast because of the internet and more people, spreading ideas that are not based on any research, but just things that they have heard or whatnot, and then developing it and believing in it. And I think also the way people take information that isn't based on evidence but becomes so attached to it that becomes part of their identity, I think
Oh yes.
is a major aspect of this. And it makes it much
Identity.
more intense because it's kind of like a religion almost, where it's
It's
like,
about identity and tribalism.
yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. So
Yeah.
it becomes so consuming of who they are that the idea of being wrong is just not possible and not negotiable, and there's no room for compromise or trying to get through the weeds there. So
I mean, this is all really about cognitive biases.
yeah,
And when discussing cognitive biases, we have to begin by examining our own cognitive biases, right? So even having this conversation, I'm acutely aware of the arrogance of assuming I know truth,
oh for sure, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And we have to keep in mind that something is pseudoscience up until it is a paradigm shifting reality. So in the history of science, for example, we've had moments where um, we're looking for, I guess, as heathens would say something completely anathema to mainstream scientific thought, and then a generation later would be proven correct. And people online who yell at me think that they're Galileo. If
okay,
you're talking about
yeah,
vaccine efficacy, for example, they insist
yeah,
the vaccines are poisons, and I'm saying no, the evidence doesn't say that. And they'll say, well, that's what they said to Galileo, and it's true. There are Galileo moments throughout history.
yeah,
It's just that there are a lot more non-Galileo moments.
yes,
There are a lot more cranks who are just wrong. However, it does behoove us as scientists to consider every proposed strange theory with some due diligence, offer up the analysis of whatever evidence is available, dismiss it with a degree of respect, and move on. The problem is we have to keep on revisiting that over and over again when your dismissal is not accepted, not because it wasn't based on some sound evidentiary process, but because the outcome was not to their liking.
yeah,
Right. And so I was thinking about, what drives the desire for acceptance of pseudoscience, pseudohistory, whatever it might be. I think at its core, right now in history, as opposed to previous generations, it's an innate distrust of the elite, of which you
yeah,
and I apparently are.
yeah, I guess, yeah,
So, distrust in government, distrust in media, distrust in any institution that for some reason does not appear to be in line with your way of thinking at the moment. And as a result, what we see is those who adhere to pseudoscientific belief tend to have a lot of things in common. There tends to be economic dispossession. There tends to be some sort of it tend to be male, frankly. They tend to
yeah,
be of a certain ideological bent politically. They tend to live in the same areas. They tend to know each other. So again, sociologically, I can know a lot about you simply by knowing who your 15 best friends are. So that same network
right,
effect is in place. So innate distrust is one. There's of course the Dunning-Kruger, and if people don't know, the Dunning-Kruger effect is the less you know about something, the more confidently you will espouse a false understanding of that thing. So I think Darwin called it ignorance begetting confidence.
mm,
So the more people know about a thing, the more humble and uncertain they talk about it. But the less they know about it, the more confidently they espouse its falsehoods. And that's really the Dunning-Kruger effect. And right now, I think there's an epidemic of Dunning-Kruger. We have confirmation bias and selection bias. We have people looking up stuff online, not to find quote unquote truth, but to confirm their current beliefs already. I mean,
yes,
you talked about pseudo history. I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah,
And pseudo history is fun. It's fun. As a
yeah, sure,
non-historian, I can
sure,
see why. And so
yeah,
I'd be Googling things not about the boring or the mainstream history of ancient Egypt, for example, but about the fun stuff, the aliens.
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's just like science fiction, people like that aspect. And I think a lot of it's just because, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of empowerment people get when it comes to thinking that they may know something that others are rejecting, mainstream
Yeah,
society is overlooking.
I feel
And it's like,
special.
but I know there's something more out there. And I think that's just something it makes their life more interesting. It makes them feel like they're more relevant and part of something greater than themselves, I guess.
Right, which is why you can't combat this with evidence. You
Right.
this is about
Yes.
relationship building.
Yeah.
I know. The other cognitive biases that come to mind, like sunk cost fallacy, where you're already invested in this belief system. I'm going to continue to double down in this belief system because I've come this far. Why not? Why not continue? Clustering illusion. So clustering illusion is when you see patterns that aren't there. And it's common in epidemiology. We look for that when we look at data. That's why we're always on guard for over analyzing data sets. We can produce significance where there isn't any. But what social psychologists have discovered is that those who are more attuned to seeing patterns are more attuned to adhere to conspiracy theories, even when those theories aren't present. So it's possible to see patterns that aren't there. That's a very
Yeah.
common thing. And then there's hope. So if your health is failing, and science isn't giving you the answers that you want or need, then you're going to start looking elsewhere and really be invested in looking elsewhere. Um, I've known people, dying of cancer, for example, and they start turning to quackery
Mm.
when there is zero evidence that it works, and they really feel strongly about it because what
Yeah.
else have they got?
Yeah. They're
You know,
desperate. Yeah.
they're desperate. Exactly, desperation is a big part of this. And during the pandemic, we saw a lot of that. The other two thing to consider is social media, which I'm sure we can talk about for
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
has really been an accelerant of this phenomenon because it contributes to the tribalism,
Yep.
and also because science doesn't speak in tweets. We try, but it's not innately tailored for the nuance required. Tweets are, for example. So what I like to tell my students, for example, is that, do you know the average number of people that reads a peer-reviewed science article?
Not
There's been
much.
some
Yeah.
there's been some research on this, and it looks like it's two,
Yeah. Well,
which
yeah.
may
Yep.
which may or may not include the author.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Whereas the average number of people that sees a pseudoscience anti-vax YouTube clip is in the millions.
Yep.
And that's put out in a matter of hours, whereas a peer-reviewed paper takes weeks, if not months, to get into press. So science, by due to its very nature of being deliberate and careful and nuanced, always loses the dialogue narrative war because we're slow.
Yep.
And we're only now learning to use social media. But in doing so, so many of us are snarky and combative. And then we lose traction that way. We can't win.
Yes.
If you're accepting and polite, then that is used to bludgeon you with bluntness and rudeness, and eventually you take mental health breaks and you need a lot of alcohol. Whereas
Yeah.
if you fight back for your mental health, now you're dismissed as a crank who's just an asshole online. There isn't an obvious way forward yet. But we're on a tangent there. It's I mean, what is pseudoscience? We haven't even talked about that yet.
Yeah.
Um, is it false belief? Could be. Um, is it imperfect belief? It could be. Is it the manufacturing of your own reality? I think that's the part that gets a bit more concerning. Flat earthers, for example, they're now
Sure.
germ deniers. You know what germ deniers are? People who
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
insist that there are no such thing as bacteria or viruses.
Right.
Uh, you know, so those individuals are pushing paradigms of such divorcedness from our consensus reality that it's unclear what to do about them, and it's easy to dismiss them, but their reach is long. And
Yes.
like, I dismissed flat earthers 10 years ago as a joke. I think it was a joke. I think it started at 4chan or something as someone trying to get attention. But then and I used to make fun of like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Why are you arguing with these 4chan dudes who are just trying to rile you up? Then it became a real thing. So enough people started buying into the joke. You touch onto those with a fringe of mental illness, and suddenly you're into some new domain. Uh, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm off on several tangents there.
No, I
This
mean
is
those are all good points, and I really like the how you mentioned, building relationships with people that may be in these communities that often are kind of becoming engulfed in what many would call pseudoscience. Because I think that's a big aspect to it. If you never have a chance to talk to someone who's an epidemiologist or an astrophysicist, you're less likely to ever, consider perhaps, what they have to say as legitimate if you're being told by one of your friends, oh, these guys are just, hiding the truth from you. So,
Yeah, I we all like. Again, I'm an epidemiologist. I have some other qualifications. I remember talking to my own father about things, and like he'd be saying, I didn't know like this drug had this effect. And he'd call up his brother in New York who has no training in any of this and say,
yeah,
did you know about this? I'm sitting next to him saying, I'm an expert on this topic. Ask me. But of course,
yeah,
you dismiss your own kid because what
right.
does he know? He's just an expert.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, that's
So
a big part of it. Yeah,
other things that I think really do, especially in my field, when we're combating COVID misinformation and vaccine misinformation, there is this underlying innumeracy and scientific illiteracy in the population that frankly has made it almost impossible to get evidence-based messages across.
mm,
We've lost our like I mean, you're in the USA, I'm in Canada, but we have similar problems education-wise. We sort of invested less in science literacy over the past few decades, invested less in civics literacy too. So
yes,
all that
definitely.
is kind of built in as well. And the innumeracy I find is insidious. And I'll give you an example from COVID. Early on, the minimizers were saying things like, why should I be afraid of a disease that is 99% survivable? And the IFR for COVID, the infection fatality rate, is about 1%, meaning 1% of people who get it are going to die. So
Hmm.
it's not unreasonable to say it is 99% survivable. The problem is that they assume that that's a big number, 99%. That's actually not that big for an infectious disease. A
Yeah.
1% IFR is actually huge.
Historically, I mean, that's a big deal. Yeah.
Big deal. And that to me is the insidious innumeracy here. People think they understand math because I know what 1% means. I did grade 12 math, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's without context. It's knowledge without context, therefore without wisdom. And as I tell people, okay, let's say you have a 1% chance of dying if you cross the street. How many crosses does it take for you to start getting worried?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's
um,
true.
yeah. Yeah, or if a million people are commuting to work on the morning in the city you live, 1% of that is like 10,000 people. If 10,000 people died this morning, that's
Yeah.
newsworthy.
And that
That's
gets to a number that everyone knows someone who, died. So,
yeah,
uh,
absolutely. So that's the inability to conceptualize that. The other aspect of innumeracy is a little more advanced, and that is people cannot internalize exponential growth.
mm,
A lot of papers have been written about this, how exponential growth is not something innate to human consciousness. Evolutionarily, we are driven to understand linear growth. Throwing a spear in the Serengeti, right? The spear is going to go that way, it's going to fall there. It makes sense for my brain to understand that.
yeah.
But I'm never going to accelerate at 0 0.1 Gs in Serengeti. There's no need to understand exponential growth. As a result, we are always failing to understand how fast it is. And I have an example of this failure. Where I live in Ontario, the at one point the Attorney General was being asked about why we aren't implementing COVID controls, even though the cases are mounting fast, exponentially. And she said, we're waiting to see if the modeling is reflected in the hospitalization numbers before we act. And I was slapping my forehead saying, that's the nature of exponential growth. By the time you see it,
Yeah.
it's too late to act.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that's infuriating, but there's no obvious way to teach a gut understanding of exponential growth, especially not through words,
Yeah.
especially not through tweets. And that was instructive. I thought most people, like most of us, hadn't thought about this. But okay, I'll explain to the world that this is going to grow exponentially. So by next Tuesday, it's going to be this amount and so forth. But people could not understand that. Then there's relative risk versus absolute risk. The If I say the vaccine doubles your risk of myocarditis, oh my God, that's horrifying. But your absolute risk goes from 0.0001% to 0.0002%.
Right.
It
Yes.
doubled, but it's still really, really small.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, that conceptualization is completely lacking. Media has been complicit in this, absolutely. So the absolute risk versus relative risk is a classic media headline play.
Yeah.
It's far more inciting for them to say risk is doubled than it is to say absolute risk is minuscule. Or the, saying, Fox News famously was talking about the 99% survival rate and dismissing it that way, even though their statisticians knew better.
Right.
So there's deliberate media contribution to pseudoscience, and there's also unconscious contribution via just the standard operating procedures that media has to always choose the inciting headline, to always publish the thing that is newsworthy rather than the thing that is calming.
Yeah.
So, what are the solutions here? I have a paper coming out on this. When it comes to public health, miscommunication and public health combating of pseudoscience, we have to reinvest in science literacy to inoculate the population against bad ideas, pun intended.
Yeah.
Right? But that will take a generation or more.
Yes.
It's not something to fix right away.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
the other thing.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, I think when it comes to all these issues, I mean, really just stems from how educated is your society? How are they being prepared to deal with this? Because if the education is not there, then you're constantly behind, and you're constantly trying to play catch up. And I agree. That's why it takes generation, after generation to instill these ideas and understanding of statistics and probability and what diseases are in the first place, basic epidemiology or whatnot, because without that knowledge, people are constantly in the dark, and then it's very easy for a media company with an interest perhaps in making something more exciting than it is, or communicating something in a political way, to sort of trick people into following what they're saying. So
and I don't know the solution because no one trusts media anymore, because they, depending upon your ideology, you think that media outlet is ideologically bent against me and this one isn't.
Right.
And the other side thinks it's flipped. I don't know anymore. It's such an insidious issue. And a lot of it is also conspiratorial.
Yep.
So the idea that pharmaceutical companies are all evil and money grubbing. Well, they are evil and money grubbing. I've consulted to a bunch of them. Yeah, they're all about money. Absolutely. Doesn't mean their products don't work.
Right.
And I'll give you an example how it's easily dismissed. Like there's a strong narrative online about Pfizer's documents showing that they're aware that the spouses of vaccinated people could show side effects. They're looking out for it. And therefore, vaccine shedding is a thing. In reality, the Pfizer documents were drawn up in standard practice when looking at adverse events for any injected thing, where if you're sleeping with someone, just in case they come in contact with your injection site and it's dripping or something and they lick it for some reason, maybe we should see if that's transferred over. It has nothing to do with vaccine shedding. But all it takes is someone not to have read the document, making assumptions about the title of it, sharing those assumptions online, and no one takes the time to actually read the source material. And this gets spread everywhere, and that leverages the innate distrust of that institution to begin with, to go viral again. And once something goes viral, you just can't retract it. Like scientific journals that publish falsehoods, the falsehoods are read at a much higher rate than the retractions are. And that's obviously an ongoing issue. I would say that the process of peer review also isn't complicit in this, but has not been helping.
Yeah.
So peer review is so slow, and peer review is imperfect and so incredibly flawed actually these days. Like I peer review so many things in a given week. I don't give it the attention that it needs. A lot of stuff falls through the cracks. I run a journal myself, and our peer review process is similar. Like we send it out, it comes back. I don't know how careful the reviewers were looking at things. I've seen in the COVID era atrociously bad things published in top journals that really fed the pseudoscience narrative. Papers that should have been retracted because they were clearly wrong. The stats were done wrong. The methodologies were tragically flawed. And sure, maybe months later, a fraction of these were retracted, but the damage has been done.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know what the solution is for that. Um, some people have proposed post review as opposed to peer review, where publish everything and
Mm.
let the community decide afterwards whether it's good or bad. I don't know if that's a good idea.
Yeah, that
During
sounds, yeah,
Sounds
risky.
fishy, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, the rise of the preprint became common knowledge. Preprints are papers that enter public discourse before or while they're being peer reviewed, and they're tweeted out all like, "Hey, the vaccine causes more injuries than COVID does," which is not true, by the way. But one paper reported to find this as a preprint,
Yeah.
um, and that gets shared everywhere before peer review takes care of it. I've been an expert witness in a variety of court cases where preprints are entered into evidence in courtrooms. And this is astounding to watch. Like,
Yeah.
this does not belong anywhere near impactful decision making.
Wow.
Our discussion is about pseudoscience, but it's a lot more than that.
Yes.
There are holes in society that is allowing um, flawed reasoning to flourish and to cause almost intractable damage to the fabric of society. And I don't mean to scare people, but you should be scared. This is a big problem.
Yeah.
Uh, and when we first started this conversation, my first impulse was to talk about paradigm shifts and how we have to be forgiving towards those with different paradigmatic beliefs and be humble about our beliefs, all of which I still adhere
Yeah.
to. But now I'm a little scared and angry again. Now that you've allowed me to go on a monologue for a while.
Well, sorry to bother you, but that it's something that needs to be addressed, and we're just gonna have to grind through it, I guess. Um, yeah, I mean it's interesting. There's so many aspects to this, and trying to find a solution for so many problems that are connected. I mean, this is what's going on with pseudoscience and also just misinformation in general is has to be the historic problem of our generation, it seems like, and one that could be for many generations to come, unfortunately,
It
because
could be a good thing. Could be a good thing.
yeah,
And I'll tell
hopefully,
you why. I'll tell you why it'd be a good thing, because we talked about paradigm shifts before. Every now and then, science gets kicked in the ass. Galileo kicked us in the ass. Einstein kicked us in the ass. Alvarez with plate tectonics kicked us in the ass. The shift from miasma theory to gene theory was a kick in the ass. I think we're probably due for another paradigm shift, for another rethinking of what reality is, rethinking of how we define ontology and epistemology.
mm-hmm.
And for the people watching, ontology is knowing what is, and epistemology is how do I know what is. And so much of what is discussed online around science is about ontology. These are the facts. Earth is flat. The Earth is spherical. Whatever. Epistemology is where we should focus. As this is how I think I know about a thing. And how I think I know about this thing is based upon certain assumptions about the universe, certain methodological assumptions.
Yeah,
And this, I think, is where the proper conversation should be. I think I know about this because I have done these analyses, and these analyses have these strengths and these weaknesses. What a pseudoscientist would respond with often is, I don't trust you because you're funded by big pharma. Right? It's
yeah,
the
yeah,
lowest level of criticism.
right,
But by keep on stressing the methodology, you elevate the conversation continuously in the hopes that eventually enough conversation occurs that new paradigms of research and reality emerge.
mm-hmm.
Again, it sounds Pollyanna-ish of me, but I think that's probably how we have to go, assuming civilization does not collapse in the next 50 years.
Yeah. Well, we'll hope for the best. Um, I mean, hopefully yes, I think the right response from the science community is to, you know, sort of work harder to cover more bases. Why are people asking these questions? Clearly, they're interested and they're curious about the subject. And I think we also have to understand that, I mean, yes, there are going to be people that are always going to be promoting some sort of pseudoscience, and they're going to have like their YouTube channels or whatever. But the majority of people, even many of their listeners, perhaps, but or the people that are just in general, maybe listen to them, but also check out other things, and they're just open minded. They're not sure what to believe. I think the majority of people are kind of just don't know what to think, and I think that's the game, is kind of to win over that crowd, those people
Yeah,
that are not sure. Because I think
good
if you're
point.
focusing on trying to convert people, that are basically the ones hosting the YouTube channels, that's just I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So
I hope that's true. I think I'm afraid of appeal to authority.
Hmm.
I know sometimes people see me as an authority figure because I've got a
Yeah,
PhD in this particular topic, therefore I should know what I'm talking about.
sure.
And I try really hard to dissuade that way of thinking. On
Hmm.
Twitter, for example, I don't use my title. People know who I am, but I'm not
Yeah, okay.
just doctor or professor because that shouldn't drive it.
Yeah,
You know, I think what does drive it is trustworthiness and relationship building.
yeah.
And also that also worries me because what does trustworthiness means? Often that that's also a title of some kind. But if you can be seen to be consistently humble and
Hmm.
transparent, neither of which I am, but if you can seem to be consistently humble and transparent, I think in the long run, your arc will bend towards trustworthiness.
Yeah.
And therefore, whatever you have to say will at least be given time and consideration. I don't really see, though, in the short term, how we overcome this trend towards tribalism. And I'm reminded of a book by Michael Ignatieff, who was a scholar, then became like a politician in Canada, and he's a
Hmm.
scholar again now. The book was Blood and Belonging. And in this book, he looked at the former Yugoslavia and its decay into various Balkanized states. And his conclusion was that in absence of a strong democratic umbrella, people will feel unsafe and uncertain and will retreat to the safety of their tribal brothers and sisters.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. In absence of a trustworthy super umbrella of care, maybe that's what government or media offers, but in absence of that, people are retreating to their tribal niches,
Yeah.
like and would have greater faith in what my cousin said this, and I trust him because I know him,
Right.
versus Dr. Blah on the YouTube said that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think
Yeah.
that's driving a lot of this lack of faith in the umbrella of leadership.
Yeah.
And I stop short of saying the state because it doesn't have to be the state. The
Hmm.
umbrella of leadership can be intellectual leaders, it can be media leaders, it can be moral leaders. But somehow in the last couple of decades, that's decayed, and that's why we have intellectual tribalism, and that worries me deeply.
Yeah, I think this that kind of highlights the need for more people, in the medical sphere to get involved in sort of public communication. And it doesn't have to be on the national level. I think I imagine to be huge for people in working in rural hospitals. Everyone's going to the doctor for something at some point in their lives.
Yeah.
But if doctors are communicating with their patients about these things, about it means much more because they already have a relationship with that patient. I think that doctors probably need to be taking more science communication classes in college to even become a doctor because it's becoming something where it's crucial, I think, to the
I will add a
field.
caveat to that. There's a caveat to
Yeah,
that. One of the issues we have, especially in the COVID era, is a lot of doctors, not majority, a
yeah.
tiny fraction, but enough of them are saying nonsense to their patients,
Well, that's the other issue is
right?
making
And
sure
that's
the
pushing.
doctors. Yeah,
Yeah, and so on one hand,
yeah,
you have these trusted figures like we want,
yeah,
these educated figures like we want, but
yeah,
they're saying pseudoscientific nonsense. And the
yeah,
reason for that is twofold, I feel. One is they suffer from the same tribalistic disease I mentioned. And the second is something we really have to fix in all levels of professional expertise, and that is expertise creep,
hmm,
right? Just because you're, I don't know, an ear, nose, throat doctor doesn't mean you know anything about infectious diseases
yeah,
at the population level. Just because you're a family doctor doesn't mean you know anything about radiology. Just because
yeah,
I'm an epidemiologist doesn't mean I know anything about treating patients. I don't.
right,
Um, but in times of a public health crisis in particular, people need to stay in their lanes, you know?
yeah, yeah,
And I see so much. Like I teach medical school and I try to inculcate in them, these are the limits of your knowledge.
hmm,
Unfortunately, we're always instilling in them hyper confidence
okay,
and therefore the ability and confidence to overstep their knowledge. Most medical schools, you give them one epidemiology class. It means very little. It doesn't mean you understand how to do these studies or even
right,
read the relevance of these studies.
yeah,
We have doctors, for example, claiming, well, masks don't work because I read a study that said that. in how to
Yeah.
counter it. The study is crap, and I show you why it's crap.
Sure.
So that is a problem, is we have to reinvest in all professional classes, including my own, how to recognize the limits of your knowledge and expertise and know when not to overstep them, because
Yeah.
that will cause problems.
Yeah. That's an interesting aspect. I think also it's another interesting aspect of that is just, when it comes to sort of how a medical facility and the doctors in it practice, um, their care for patients, because, one of the big complaints about medical care in general is bureaucracy. And if people, for example, knowing how to treat lots of different things in a general perspective without being like, what, I'm not touching this, and making people go through all these medical loopholes, which I think also breeds distrust in the system. Because I think the quality of a healthcare system says a lot to the patients about whether these people are trustful or it's all about
Yeah,
money. And I think that's like a fine balance to try to have, where yeah, you want
yeah,
people to not giving out misinformation about stuff, but you also want them to not make patients feel like, oh, this person's not treating me. This is a very basic thing, and this just feels like a money
it's
grab.
it's really funny you say that. I get it all the time. I'm accused.
Yeah,
You're a pharma show. Big pharma is paying you to say these things, but big pharma has paid me zip.
right.
Just they paid me one time, and I
Yeah,
donated my fee to charity. But anyway,
yeah,
um, but yeah, the accusations of you're being paid to this are rife. On the other hand, those same people are fine taking direction from Elon Musk, for example, who makes billions off these
yeah,
things,
yeah.
or from like
Right.
certain social media influencers I won't name, who are making hundreds of millions of dollars off of pushing these narratives.
Yes,
So
definitely.
it's selective discounting of information based upon the criterion of payment. It's
Hmm.
so selective, and that's what I really struggle with understanding.
Yeah,
It's like you cannot see the grift going on over here, but you are presuming there is a grift happening in front of you by people who are actively helping you.
yep.
And that is amazing to me. And I think so much of this is just a deeply seated discontentment of lashing out against those who are close to you
Hmm.
and those who you have finagled some resentment towards throughout your life unconsciously.
Right.
So if you're a part of an underclass, you probably have some resentment towards lawyers and doctors unconsciously,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they do better in life in some ways.
Right.
Um, and so that comes out. But to have that same discontentment towards Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, oh no, they're champions of free speech, and I want to be on their team,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
They've never hurt me in any way. It's just weird thinking. So again, so much of this is just unexplored social psychological trauma
Yeah.
that I think in multiples of PhD theses should be written about this and explored.
Yeah. Well, I mean, healthcare, I guess, in general, is just so much more personal than many other facets of society.
Yeah,
That, what Elon Musk is doing for, I guess, these people is just like, okay, whatever. But he's criticizing the people that I criticize. Therefore,
therefore
we're
it's
on the
good.
same team on that.
Yeah.
Which makes me think then, though, what do you make of the attempts then for people to debate promoters of pseudoscience?
Yes, not a fan. So I wrote an article about this, and I was citing one of my. I would sound like a real egghead here. One of my favorite books is Plato's Gorgias, or Georgius, however you want to pronounce it. And Georgius is about the debate between Socrates and Georgius. Georgius being the master of rhetoric, and Socrates being the master of reason. And Socrates, argues that debate is often pointless because it is won by rhetoric and not by sound argument.
Hmm.
So it is possible, in fact, probable, that
Yeah.
whoever is perceived to be supreme in such an intellectual exchange is not the person who's right, it's the person who's more charismatic.
Yeah.
I've been invited on debates, and I say, I'm tempted, but I don't
Yeah.
trust my charisma to win the
Yeah.
day. And the crucible of truth in science is not charisma; it should be the weight of evidence. And the appropriate crucible for science is peer review.
Yep.
That's
Right.
where it happens.
It's
Um,
evidence, and yeah.
and anyone can submit a paper
Yeah.
to a journal. We're not going to discriminate against you based upon your seniority or your funding, whatever it might be, because it's blinded for the most part. Come publish in my journal, I'll take you. Put your arguments out in public and let the community of experts have a go. Um, on the other hand, there is something to be said for the debate stage for engaging the non-expert, because where else will they see this exchange?
Mm-hmm.
So I think certain questions are amenable to debate if the rules are transparent and if the nature of the outcome, or rather the intent of the outcome, is clear as well. And by which I mean, so often participants in this kind of debate aren't looking to win; they're looking to be seen.
Yeah.
So I was invited on the Joe Rogan podcast many years ago to debate Peter Duesberg, who was an HIV denier. He didn't think that HIV was the proximal cause of AIDS.
Okay.
I said no to the debate for a lot of reasons,
Yeah.
but one of them was I don't want to give this guy any airtime.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
been proven wrong many times, and even if I prove him wrong again, what have I accomplished except to be present as he gains an even wider audience?
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a variety of arguments for the purpose of debate. Among them is, to find the truth. Among them is to expound your position. Another one is to simplify arguments. But one of them is to gain a new audience for your viewpoint.
Yeah.
And very often I'm challenged to debate by people who have no audience. So they're trying to glom onto whatever audience I have.
Sure.
Right. So what do I gain from this? Nothing,
Yep.
except possibly the elevation of a perspective and set of beliefs that I find distasteful.
Right.
But again, some things are amenable to debate, but not things like vaccine efficacy. You can look up vaccine efficacy.
Yes.
And I think maybe it's the word debate that's the problem. Explaining how these things are done is completely fair game. Answering questions about the flawed nature in which these things are done is also fair game. So, but famously, Joe Rogan had invited on RFK Jr. and Peter Hotez to debate.
Yes, I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
Yes, and that infuriated me because it was an attempt by two charismatic individuals, Joe Rogan and RFK Jr., to really just dump on Peter Hotez, who has made his positions already clear on these points. There is nothing to be gained here. So some things do not lend themselves to that particular dynamic.
Yeah.
Like the monk debates in Toronto, they decide a winner based upon the percentage of the audience whose minds were changed. So take a poll beforehand and say, X percent believes this side, Y percent believe that side, and Z percent are open to having their minds changed. So first of all, you're assuming people are telling the truth. And then afterwards, they take another poll and see how much the weights have changed. And whoever changed the most minds is declared the winner. That's a fun sporting event.
Right.
Absolutely. It's a fun thing to do.
Yes. Yeah.
When the stakes are will a vaccine be taken up by people and therefore saving their lives? Those are huge stakes to put on display in a sporting event.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not
Yep.
sure what we gain from it. So yeah, that's how I feel about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, yes, I completely understand what you're saying, because I've always found debates to be more of a sporting event than an actual, process and, searching for some type of truth on a subject. To me, I find it mostly to be just, for show, and really have no benefit to anyone, especially if you're talking about something that is very well established, based on mountains and mountains of evidence. If you're debating that, then you've already kind of lost in the first place, because the platform you're going on to debate it almost always, especially if it's like the Joe Rogan podcast, is clearly, to amplify the other person, who's there saying what, Joe Rogan wants to hear, or whatever his audience wants to hear. It's not an objective
It's not objective.
audience.
It's
It's
not a
not
fair
yeah, it's not a
platform.
place for a conversation to be had. I think if people want to have conversations, that's fine. That's much better than trying to debate people, where
Right.
we've kind of established that's not a game that anyone wins. It's just about scoring points. But I don't think people tend to gravitate towards conversations very often, unfortunately, and that
That's
seems to be
true.
it seems to be
Uh,
more personal to have a conversation and more polite, and a lot of this is just to get an audience and people who like to see the fighting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm quick to add, like I enjoy Joe Rogan's 3 hour format. I think it
Sure.
lends itself well to thorough conversations. He said
Yeah.
some ridiculous things these past couple of years that have made me quite, have removed me as a
Yeah.
fan.
Yeah.
But historically, I think he's done well in that podcast. So the opportunity to have discussions, absolutely.
Right.
It's the word debate that triggers me a bit.
Yeah.
And one way to think about this is to consider that there are debate teams in the world. There are people who
Yeah.
train for debate, and
Yeah.
they train by taking random sides on an issue. You're
Yes.
good at it if you can argue any side, regardless of whether you feel strongly about it. That tells you right there, it's not about the
Yeah.
quality of the truthful argument. This
Yes.
is not going to be a crucible of truth. It's going to be an arena of combat.
Right.
Different things entirely.
Yes, that's important to highlight. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, when I saw people various times I've seen scientists in good faith try to go on whether it's Joe Rogan or other shows to debate, and I think to myself like I totally understand what you're trying to do, but I think you're missing the point of why they asked you, and why they asked you is really to legitimize the other
Be a
uh,
punching bag. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They're trying to legitimize their beliefs by bringing you on, showing, hey, look, this person's willing to come and debate it, which means it's debatable. um, when it's obviously a lot of these things are not. So that's it's good to there's obviously conversations you can have about stuff, and if you go deep enough, I think on a subject, you can find things that we're not sure about scientifically. But that's a
Yeah.
conversation. That's a totally different thing.
Yeah. You don't debate facts, you debate policies,
Yeah.
right? You debate opinions. But you don't debate, is the earth round or flat? That's a
Right.
fact. We can prove it one or the other.
Right.
You
Yeah.
debate, given that the earth is round, what should we do about satellites falling from the sky? You debate that situation where
Yeah.
there's variance in public opinion, not facts.
Yes.
This should be self-evident.
Yes. Yes. Well, I guess the other factor is just the people that tune in each week to watch these shows. If you think that you're a go on eater, you're gonna change the minds of the audience. Very
Mm.
few people are ever watching the show because you're coming on it. They're watching the show because Joe Rogan's on it.
I will tell you, one of the reasons I said no to the Peter
Yeah.
Duesberg debate was at that point in my career, my ego could not handle being the bad guy.
Yeah.
And I know going on there with his conspiratory
Yes.
minded audience, I would be the villain because they
Yes.
want to believe the guy with the iconoclastic perspective.
Right.
And my poor little heart couldn't take it because I was such a fan of the show at the time. Like, don't make me the villain on a show that I like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a thing. Yeah. I think that was probably a wise move because I don't think that would be very beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the long run, it's yeah. I mean, if people, I think at the end of the day, the audience, because you're not going to be able to change the minds of people that I think are diehards. It's kind of like if someone has a very very strong religious belief on an issue, and it's not very open to people with any other ideas. Like you're probably not going to change that person's mind on something. I think that when it comes to science communication in general, the goal has to be to look at the people that are just kind of uncertain about what to believe. They hear lots of stuff. They're not necessarily diehards for any viewpoint. And I think most people are thinking about sort of kitchen and table issues when it comes to their life. They're thinking about how do I provide for my family, you know, and maybe they listen to Joe Rogan or maybe they listen to some news stations. They hear lots of things, but they don't have a strong opinion about this. Most people at night are not thinking about viruses or what's pseudo history and what's not pseudo history. And I think those are the people that if you're trying to experts in the field of science and history or any field, those are the people that I think you really need to be reached out to, because I think that's the average person is they don't really know what to think.
Yeah, but the problem is that even though the majority don't really know what to think, it seems that the decision makers are making decisions driven by these fringe ideas.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at how vaccine science has been vilified by several governors of US states, for
Yeah.
example, if you look at how COVID mitigation policies have been, again, vilified to the point where there is a pretense around whether the disease actually exists or not. That's not the result of a majority of people feeling a certain way. That's the result of a particular ideological class running with an idea to court a
Yes.
voting bloc.
Yeah.
So you don't really need the majority to buy into the pseudoscience if the actual elite, the
Yeah.
political elite, are
Yeah.
acting on the assumption that that pseudoscience is true. And by the way, I don't think they believe it's true. I think they're
Right.
just acting on it for
Yeah.
vile, brazen political reasons, which is probably the worst reason possible. So
Yeah.
otherwise, I would tend to agree that I don't really, I wouldn't worry about this so much. The majority of people aren't paying attention. It's just that occasionally this stuff ends up being life and death.
Yeah.
When it comes to vaccine uptake, it's literally life and death. And so I worry for the next pandemic, which is going to come,
Sure.
about our ability to engage the public, to care for one another, about our ability to argue for state-sponsored vaccine development to get us out of the next pandemic. I think the
Yeah.
political will for that will be sapped. So our ability um, to sustain ourselves through the next global public health crisis is highly impaired at the moment because of the rise of oppositional contrarian pseudoscience, which is a
Yeah.
particular brand of pseudoscience.
Yeah.
And we have to start working now to overcome it. I think it's possible.
Hmm.
We have to work at it.
Yeah. Well, I think that highlights, I think you're kind of touching base on the connection there between civics and,
Mm.
society and science. Because I mean, I think in the United States, especially, you know, one side of the coin is, I think, to try to focus on those people that are not sure what to believe in and make sure that they're kind of understanding science and, hey, you need to get vaccinated. That's kind of a big deal. The other aspect, though, is to, combat politicians who are going into office, promoting pseudoscience. And those things kind of feed each other, because if you're getting elected officials in that are promoting nonsense, that hurts, and it can convince people in the general public as well. And a lot of this is also just how the system's built in the United States when it comes to the political process, and how there are various different ways, that empowered legislators, state legislatures, for example, can basically help sort of manipulate voting blocks and
Yeah.
how decisions are being made. I mean, we talk about this all the time. I talk to former politicians all the time, um, about this stuff when it comes to like gerrymandering and all these different issues in the United States, and how influential they are, and also just like how we elect officials and that process, and
Yeah.
all these things have intangibles that connect to sort of the scientific literacy of the general public, but also to what voice are the people that are objectively for science. How strong is their voice when it comes to elections and electing people in office that represent them and their voice.
It's insidious. It's
Yeah.
an insidious calcification, solidification of a gap between two classes of individuals. That's what's happening here. And that those classes are the powerful and the less powerful. And there's certain characteristics that the powerful have that the
Yeah.
less powerful don't. It includes scientific literacy, access to nutrition and services and medical care, etc., confidence that their vote will count, etc. All of these things are. I mean, I sound conspiracy minded when I say it sounds like there is an organized force to prise apart
Yeah.
these two levels of society. I don't really think it is that organized. I think this is just the nature of these complex systems
Yeah.
run enough times that the centrifuge of life separates them out in these ways if we let it happen.
Right.
But it is insidious. And much like the centrifuge of life, it takes energy to remix those two poles
Mm-hmm.
of solution. And so the energy here is political energy.
Yeah.
I admire, I know Arnold Schwarzenegger is big on combating the gerrymandering problem.
Yep.
I hope he has success doing so. And that is absolutely a deep
Yeah.
problem. And I think part of the problem, too, to go off on another tangent, is the evolution of the political classes in both of our countries in the last few decades, where those most capable of ethical leadership are less and less incentivized to seek leadership.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
And so we
Yes.
are regressing to a kakistocracy, which is, ruled by those least qualified to rule.
Yeah.
It's not even quite an oligarchy, it's a kakistocracy. And I don't know how we solve that except to put back the incentives for the best and brightest to seek leadership. That means protecting them from the attacks that they will receive on social media and
Yep.
so forth, and maybe removing all financial benefits because
Yeah.
that's what's attracting the least qualified to seek this kind of leadership.
Yeah, I mean it is as I think a huge part of it, and I think there's even been some studies looking at how motivated people are to run for office, and a lot of the youth I know, especially in the U.S., just thinks like, well, politics is so hopelessly corrupt. Why would I ever want to be a part of it? And unfortunately, politics is also the only thing that could solve the issues that we're
Yes,
dealing with. So,
yes,
so
that's the
that's
problem.
those are two things that are completely misaligned when it comes to
Yeah,
making progress. And yeah, it's a major problem. And you get people that often want to run for office, maybe because it is self-serving. And it's like, okay, well, if no one's stepping up to the plate to try to get involved in this process, then the people that you don't want involved are going to be involved instead.
exactly right.
Um, and
Exactly right. And our
that's a
culture is
yeah.
such. Sorry, our culture is such that we reflexively vilify political leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
It's every comedian's joke is to make fun of the politician, is to offer them as a sacrifice to whatever god is popular at the moment.
Yeah.
If a terrorist attack, why don't they take our leaders? Why the civilians? So who wants to be in that role? Who wants to be the goat of society?
Yeah.
And I use goat not in the sports metaphor, but
Right.
in the ancient metaphor. And
Yeah.
so it's um, there is no incentive anymore to rise to civic leadership. That has to change.
Yeah.
I don't see any way around it, except to redesign what a democracy looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely gonna take sort of, I mean, these are problems that people just will have to solve, and
Not
every
us.
yeah, every generation's every generation's involved, is going through something. So, if people want to have a better situation, someone's gonna have to step up at some point, and hopefully we make some progress. But I mean, at the
Might
end
I
of the day,
suggest not royalty? Let's not do royalty again.
yes, that would not be beneficial, probably. Yeah, the history of royal families running things, that probably would even lower the standard even more when it comes to who's in office running things, since
Well,
you
let me
never
ask
know.
you. I mean, as a
Yeah.
historian, I mean, we talked about modern pseudoscience, but this is not the first time that societies have dealt with um, falsehoods reigning supreme. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
so there are ways. I mean, usually requires some sort of intellectual revolution, whether this be enlightenment, for example,
Yep.
was a revolution. So are we looking likely at another kind of intellectual revolution to drag us from this mire?
Yeah, I
Do
mean
you think?
that's an interesting question. Historians are never great at predictions, unfortunately, when it comes to these things, because it's very hard to see, what happens. I mean, I tend to be fairly optimistic. I mean, because if you do look at history, the one thing that we can see is, if we're looking at today to the past, we are way more scientifically sound than we ever were. And I mean, throughout history, most societies were run by people that rejected science for the most part. So that was pretty, it's a low bar when you start going back in time.
Right.
You're trying to understand the scientific literacy of a society. Today,
Yeah.
I think, though, we're in kind of a moment where the trajectory, I think, will be shaped a lot by, I think, especially in the United States, it'll be shaped a lot by upcoming elections, and, who's taking the role of the presidency. I think that's going to be a huge factor, because with these very slim majorities in Congress, for example, in the United States, whoever becomes president, and if anyone were able to actually have a large enough majority in the House and Senate, you could basically do all sorts of stuff. Um, and right now in American politics, it's a huge mess, as I think the entire world has seen. Um, whether it's from electing a president that isn't hated by 50% of the population, to even having political parties that can't be unified on issues,
Yeah.
fighting within themselves. So it's a time of probably some of the most political turmoil in American history. And
Yeah.
whether that
It's not
continues,
just your country, it's happening here as
and
well
it's
in my
happening in
country.
Canada as well. And I'm
Yeah.
curious then, to sort of ask you, to what extent has the United States situation when it comes to, sort of pseudoscience, to what extent has that impacted Canada? Uh,
Huge. It's been huge. Let me tell you, when to bring this conversation full circle, when I first started blogging about the pandemic, as I mentioned, my blog got 200 readers per week, and it went to 500,000. Then I mentioned a couple of American situations, including when these two doctors from Bakersville, California, insisted the pandemic was over based upon very flawed calculations. And I blogged about their calculations, and I explained why they were wrong. That got me a flood of hate mail from the Americans. I've never seen anything like it before,
wow.
because how dare I suggest that their pandemic might not be over. And that just, and then after that, I started seeing more and more the American verbiage reflecting in the hate mail I got from Canadians.
Hmm.
And so it's almost like they were reading from the same playbook.
Yeah.
And I must say, there's a certain ideological bent to that playbook. It was the MAGA Trump cadre
Yes. Yeah.
reflected in our right wing. So there seems to be a kind of continuity of ideology there that was contributing to the play.
Yeah.
Now, the pseudoscience comes from both ends of the political spectrum, the right and
Yes.
the left.
Definitely.
The
Yes.
yeah. So I mean, the extreme left, it tends to be the crystals and the mantras and stuff, and the extreme right, it tends to be
Yeah.
the extreme hatred for all things elite, meaning
Yeah.
educated.
Yeah.
But to the extent that the Americans played a role here in Canada, it was in the extreme right.
Yeah.
Um, so, but I do want to say though, like we've been talking about how scientific literacy is on the whole higher now than it was 200 years ago by virtue of the Age of Enlightenment. I want to put another call in for a re-examination for the paradigm of science. We cannot be comfortable in our belief system all the time. And I hope that as we remake our education systems that do require remaking,
Yeah.
that we redefine science. Science is not truth. Science is a methodology for approximating our understanding of truth. And our methodology is understandably flawed. And I hope people can understand the strengths and weaknesses of our methodologies so that the weaknesses are not misunderstood as lies,
Yep.
right? And the strengths are not misunderstood as absolute truths.
Yeah.
One of the things I like to say whenever I comment on the pandemic for media is all of this is true until further notice, because as more evidence is accrued and as we weight evidence differently, we may reach different conclusions. Science must be living and breathing and evolving. And among the hateful messages we get is, you told us this back in May of 2020. Now you're saying this, which is different,
Yeah.
because more evidence became available. And that's a good thing.
Right.
So a misunderstanding of what science is, I think, must be addressed before we can even begin to fix this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of work that needs to be done. I mean, I guess the good news, and one thing I guess that I think history can always sort of provide is, if you look at the history of problems that people have had to solve and overcome, it seems like we've basically can have overcome all sorts of different things,
Yeah.
and so why can't we overcome this too? Based on that past. So in some ways, I think history is hope, for what we can accomplish,
Yeah,
despite
I mean,
these problems.
we're not facing the Mongols here.
Right,
We're
we're
not
not being
facing the Black Death.
invaded. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yet. Um,
And even if we were, it's society is still likely to go on. If we've overcome in the past, but yeah, it's a problem, but it's something that I think is certainly solvable because who's to say it isn't? So
yeah, hope so. I hope
yeah,
so, man.
yeah. Otherwise,
I'm
well,
getting
we
nervous.
tried. And so thanks again for coming on. And I was just curious to know,
My
like,
pleasure.
what are you currently working on and stuff?
Well, I have a new research chair, and my endowed chair focuses on artificial intelligence and how we
Oh,
can use it to improve education. And I'm not sure we can.
good
I'm
to know.
terrified about the consequences and impacts of artificial intelligence, but it's an optimistic research chair where I will look for how to use it constructively. Health on the health domain, I'm writing a book on what went wrong in pandemic communication and how we need to fix it before the next public health emergency. So that's that.
Yes. Okay.
Fun.
And what's the best way for people to follow your work then?
Sure. My last name.com is my personal website. So Deonandan, Deonandan.com. That's also my Twitter handle, or Zitter, whatever it's called now, at Deonandan. Um, and yeah, my website's got everything, including how
Yeah.
to reach me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on and sharing all your knowledge, and we'll hope for the best. So.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.